Katherine, we are so thankful to have the outstanding leadership that you have demonstrated over so many years for both accounting academia and for the profession. And we thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks for the introduction. And, you know, at my age, it's not so good to mention that I've been doing this for 30 years. Because we all know that I was not a teenager when I started. So my thanks for that really nice introduction. My thanks to Peter Easton for giving me the opportunity to be here this afternoon. My thanks to the sponsors for making all of this happen. And my thanks to all of you for coming in here and sitting down and giving me the opportunity to talk about this. Anything that I say is, of course, just my own view and doesn't represent a position of the Financial Accounting Standards Board, whose positions are arrived at only after extensive due process and deliberation. So the stars of the show are these gentlemen over here on my right. And I'm going to give a very small overview, and then we're going to get to the people who are going to deliver the value added for this session. I'm going to start on the far right, and that's Roger Grabowski, who is currently with Duff and Phelps. But he actually started the valuation practice at Price Waterhouse, which then became PricewaterhouseCoopers, which was then sold to Standard & Poor's, and now moving about again, he's with Duff and Phelps. He has an extremely long track record as a testifying expert, and that's the toughest kind of expert to be, in valuation cases that involve enterprises and assets. So his task is going to be to talk about the valuation of enterprises and assets using performance metrics. In the middle is David Marcus, who's at Cornerstone Research. And in a way, David is one of us. He has a PhD in finance from the University of Florida. But in another way, he's not one of us because he works on legal disputes involving accounting. And the two kinds of things that I've asked him to focus on in framing his use of performance indicators are restatements and solvency or capital structure analyses. The person closest to me is Matthew Rothman at Sanford Bernstein. He's also sort of one of us because he's an adjunct professor at Cornell University, and he also has a PhD in finance from the University of Chicago. And he is a quant. In other words, that's in his title, and that's what he does. And what he does is develop trading rules. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that we have been admonished two things. The first one is Stephen Penman told us that financial statement analysis must be product-oriented and decision context specific. So I've set up 3 decision contexts here for you: valuations of assets and enterprises, legal disputes, and the development of trading rules. As Jeff Barbanel pointed out yesterday, the path from research to real-world applications is not always easy or straight. And part of our panel discussion is going to be on the path from research to real-world applications. And the third reason that I'm telling you all of this is to give you a sense of the kinds of questions that you might logically direct to these gentlemen, because this is, after all, your time to ask them questions, which will be filtered through moi to make sure that everything is properly organized and directed to the right panelist. But at any time during our panel discussion, if you have a question or a comment or an interjection, please raise your hand, and I'll monitor this and make sure you have a chance. We're going to end promptly at 4 o'clock. So Peter asked me to talk about evaluating enterprise performance using financial statement analysis and to keep it short, which I will. So this has been around for a long time. In fact, if you open up Volume 1, Issue 1 of Forbes magazine in 1917, you'll see that there was a discussion of EPS, return on investment, and dividend yields. In other words, these things had been developed and were being deployed by 1915 or a little bit later, and you could see them at work in the financial journals. Within that context, there's, of course, recording performance, and then there's disaggregating it into its components, and the big name there, of course, is Donaldson Brown, who invented the Dupont Analysis sometime before 1915. I couldn't find the exact date. Doron Nithim spent a lot of time talking about disaggregating performance, and he talked about breaking it down into its constituent parts. He spoke at length about that. There's also the question, if you can measure performance, if you can break it down into its parts, a big problem is, what do you do if the thing you see now doesn't keep repeating itself over and over again, intertemporal variation. And that's where you see this major breakthrough, I would guess, in performance measurement. It's the intertemporal variation that involves discounting, where Irving Fisher made up the theory of interest, which is, of course, a huge conceptual breakthrough in thinking about intertemporal variation. And here's where I interject a little remark. So this is an observation, a personal observation. The way that I think Irving Fisher must have been thinking about this intertemporal variation was to contemplate a situation where delivered performance, that is, outcomes, don't just keep repeating themselves over and over again, but an alternative that I hear some conference participants talking about is to come up with a number which is heavily representative of the future. That is, you don't actually try to create an indicator of what happened last period, however aberrant it might be. You want to create an indicator that is somehow a normalized indicator of what tends to happen. Sometimes this might be called normalized earnings or sustainable earnings or even permanent earnings. So those are two different ways, I think, of looking at intertemporal variation. That's a big issue. I think it's actually a very big issue. Another question in this performance evaluation is growth. And here we have Myron Gordon's breakthrough where he thought about creating a constant growth model. Now, growth has been talked about over and over again at this conference. For example, Bruce Johnson's presentation was very much on point when he was talking about how do we evaluate the source and durability of competitive advantage. And he gave some very specific examples. Well, that's growth. And Xiaojun Zhang's presentation was very much focused on evaluating how you know when something is going to grow and how fast it's going to grow and how long it's going to grow at that rate. And the last thing I want to mention here in terms of performance evaluation is that there's a scale and a size indicator. And my book that I look to for that is David Solomon's book, published in 1965, which emphasized residual income, because David Solomon's was very focused on not just the rate at which something was happening, but how big it is. Now, this has been adapted by, I don't know, Stern Stewart and any number of other people to create performance indicators along these lines. As Jeff Abarbanel has pointed out, these ideas are now so well accepted that we don't think about these as research anymore. These things are now in introductory financial accounting classes. That's how well accepted they are. We don't think about them as research, even though that is what they were when they were originated. So what is some characteristics of this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it looks to something that's already happened. Almost all of the discussion at this conference so far has focused on projecting what's going to happen in the future, on forecasting something. Nearly every discussion has been focused very much on forward-looking, but enterprise performance is something that has already happened. It occurred this period. It may be typical of what will happen in the future. It may be aberrant relative to what will happen in the future. Second, enterprise performance evaluation doesn't care about management. And that's a very big deal because much research and many managers care a great deal about separating indicators of their performance from indicators of enterprise performance. It, of course, requires coming up with a measurement or some set of measurements. Typically, we'd like to keep the operations away from the financing because we think those behave very differently. We may have to adjust reported numbers. That is, EVA, for example, has a bunch of secret adjustments to reported numbers, and we heard some discussions at this conference about adjusting reported numbers. You've got to weight them, you've got to calibrate them, and you've got to put them up next to something that's a benchmark, like some competitor, or a required rate of return, or what happened last performance, or what you hoped was going to happen. One of the things I want to focus on here is that because performance evaluation refers to something that already occurred, it does bring up the question of whether what you want to do is take what already occurred and normalize it somehow, whether the adjustment that you want to make is an adjustment to take what actually happened and create a non-actual number that's a normalized indicator of what you think is going to happen. I have a couple of slides on research here. I don't have any references to working papers or published papers because I would either have to have huge volumes of them or just one example. But I will say that for the most part, I couldn't find accounting research, contemporary accounting research, that focuses much on enterprise performance, more on management performance, a stewardship type analysis, try to separate out state of the world effects. Instead, and we certainly saw this very thematically at this conference, much research tends to take returns as the true indicator of performance and then calibrate the accounting or financial statement analysis-based performance indicators against returns. And a good one, a good accounting-based indicator, is one that lines up well with the true performance indicator, and that would be returns. Typically, you don't get detailed accounting data except from SEC registrants where you already have prices. You can get some accounting data, you just can't get detailed accounting data. Research also, as this conference has certainly evidenced, uses accounting performance measures as inputs to valuation, meaning you have to predict something with these things. Now, it's been made very clear by every person who's spoken at this conference who talked about forecasting that this is actually pretty hard to do, to forecast these things out into the future, and you might want to use not just the number to predict itself, but multiple inputs to predict itself. You might also want to use financial statements to assess whether something that you're seeing now is actually representative of what's going to happen in the future. Now, I would say that Roger Grabowski is in this first category. He is using accounting performance measures as inputs to a valuation task. And when he gets an accounting performance measure, he's going to have to decide whether he needs to adjust it, forecast it, do something with it. So I think he's up in that first panel. I think that David Marcus is in the second panel. He, in some cases, is going to have to come up with a way of separating apparent performance, that is, the numbers that were reported in the first place, from real performance, which is the numbers that get reported after you do the restatement. And he's going to talk about that. And then in the third panel, we have what Matthew Rothman does. Here, we take accounting numbers as the true indicators of performance and assess whether investors rationally use this information. And by rationally, I mean promptly, because trading rules are all based on the notion that investors will get there slower than the person who's implemented the trading rule. Others have talked about questions that might be answered using financial statement analysis, and I, of course, not to be outdone, have my slide as well. You can use financial statement analysis to determine whether what you're seeing is real and whether what you're seeing is sustainable. I believe that people who want to identify short positions are very interested in this. They want to know whether the thing that is being delivered in terms of performance is real performance or just apparent performance, and whether it's sustainable. I also think that they're very concerned about earnings management fraud and the quality of earnings, a term that I do not propose to define here. I also think that they are interested in pulling out transitory and non-recurring items. Earlier today, Richard Sloan mentioned, and I understood him to say the following. He used a financial statement analysis technique to identify the inventory write-down in cost of goods sold, which creates a transitory effect in gross margins. And based on that financial statement analysis, which determines a real performance effect, he constructed what might be a nascent trading rule. Another point that was brought up by Jaron Nissen and others is separating operating leverage out of what's going on with the performance indicators to determine sensitivity to economic changes. And finally, this is something I have a personal interest in and have for quite a long time. What features of GAAP impair the usefulness of accounting data for enterprise performance evaluation? For example, the SEC, in its most recent off-balance sheet study, has pointed out to the FASB a number of places where the SEC believes GAAP impairs enterprise performance evaluation by omitting important liabilities from balance sheets. The SEC appears to be less concerned about omitted assets. And of course, there's the question of inconsistent use of measurement attributes. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop and turn